for knowing whether you are actually being narcissistically abused or not. The first tip I would offer you is to try and get some kind of objectivity. Meaning you need to get outside of yourself, you need to get out of your own subjective experience. At the philosophical level, you need to raise your consciousness, and I don't mean that in a vague, hippy-dippy sort of spiritual way, I mean it in a Western way, like you need to raise the quality of your thought, of your ability to reason, of your ability to engage in critical thinking and to challenge the quality of your own thought process and to improve it, improve your consciousness. One great way of doing that is to get out of subjectivity and emotion and opinion and to get back into objectivity, into the scientific method, and to actually gather some hard data that backs up what it is you think might be true. The most ideal way of doing that would be to get a really good qualified therapist who knows everything there is to know about cluster B personality disorder and CPTSD. However, they are about as rare as rocking horse shit, so that might not be easy to do. One thing you could supplant that with would be another person, a friend or somebody you know who has a good working grasp of the subject, and trying to work through the interactions on a case-by-case basis that you think might represent narcissistic abuse, and do this in a very specific and systematic and objective way, just to try and bring some kind of reality back to the emotional chaotic mess that these kinds of situations can create. The second tip I would have for you would be to really try and third person the scenario. So say for example you're asking the question, am I being narcissistically abused or am I just hypersensitive? You take one example, you write it down and you journal it. My recommendation would be that you change the names. So don't say I said and she said and I said and he said. Write it as though you're another person. So this is called third personing. So you've got objectivity and now you've got third personing. So you look at it as though you're the third person. So you write about Bob and Sally, or Tiago and Khaleesi, or whatever names you want. The sillier the better, the more bizarre and unlikely the names, the better it's going to be for you in this process, because you really need to get outside of this scenario and start thinking about it from a fresh perspective. Another way to do third personing might be to actually engage an imaginary third person. For example, having watched a ton of my videos, and maybe you've done a course or two of mine, you might now have quite a strong virtual reality avatar built up in your head for me. So you might write down a scenario, write it in the third person, Bob and Sally did this, and Bob said this, and Sally reacted this way, and da-da-da. And then imagine that me, the virtual reality Richie in your head, you show it to him, and what does he say? And if he goes, that's a load of shit, that clearly is a case of narcissistic abuse, and you should run away, then that's your unconscious saying to you, at the intuitive level, something is really wrong here. Or Sam Vaknin, or whoever you like, just imagine a third person, engage the right brain, engage the imagination, coming in and looking at this scenario and think, well, what would they say really? Free of my paradigms, free of my objectives, free of my issues, what would an outsider who understood the subject really say about this? The third tip that I have for you when you're trying to decide whether it is actual cluster B abuse or not is ask yourself, what's the purpose of the communication? So on a case-by-case basis, you say, okay, Bob said to Sally, blah, 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 and Sally wondered if that actually represented narcissistic abuse, or he did something to her. So from the third person point of view, we step out of it, we look at it in a cold, rational, scientific way. We apply our systems thinking type mindset to the scenario, understanding that every relationship, every interaction represents a systemic process that's occurring as a mechanism within a certain ecosystem with its own rules and its own machinations, its own fuel, its own breakdowns, its own repair process, but it chugs along as a machine, as a system, and look at it and say, what's the primary objective? Why did Bob say that to Sally right before she had to deliver that really important sales pitch? Why would he do that? What was his primary objective there? Why did, Bob says, oh, I went out with Sally, took her to meet my friends, I introduced her she's my new girlfriend, I introduced her to my best friend for the first time, and she started flirting with him really heavily. So you would ask the question, well, what do you think was the primary objective for her doing that? Is this a misguided effort on her part to show that she likes your friend and she's really trying to get pally with him because she really, really likes you, Bob? Or is this just that she's a cluster B, she's a histrionic, and any new male attention source in the environment is valid, and she will go after it. Obviously, if you've got that going on, that's not so great. Whenever we're looking at this kind of thing, I think you've got to be very, very careful with the use of the word narcissism and the use of the word narcissistic abuse. These are not black and white scenarios. It's not good enough for us to just let ourselves indulge in the luxury of just rubber stamping and writing off scenarios, experiences and people as just being narcissistic. You didn't do what I wanted you to do, so you're a narcissist. It rained on my birthday, so the sky is a narcissist. And it is getting that way. If you look at the way the online communities, not all, and certainly not most, but some are using the word narcissism. It's clearly a way of rubber stamping, of branding somebody as something so that you can discard them and push them to one side. Do you remember in medieval times in England what we used to do with criminals? We'd get like a red hot brand and we'd put the word F on their forehead, F for felon, so that they could never get work or anything ever again. They were then branded for life as a criminal scumbag. Don't do that. Because one of the temptations in that, the luxury in that, is that if you can make them the ultimate abuser, then you make yourself the ultimate victim, and a victim in black and white Hollywood narrative land is always blameless. The victim is always blameless. So if you can play the victim role, you're completely blameless, because we're not trained to think in terms of shades of grey. We're trained to think in terms of good guy, good girl, bad girl. Pure evil, pure good, and it creates a false dichotomy in our thoughts, which is not always helpful. Another good question to ask yourself is whether the quality of the interaction actually bears the classical hallmarks of cluster B. Can you see that the person engaging in this communication is behaving in a way that is exploitative, arrogant, entitled, deceptive, deliberately sort of trying to play into a false image of who they are, playing into a crazed narrative, this fake narrative that's constantly being foisted on you if you are the victim of narcissistic abuse. If none of those elements are there, then no, it's not narcissistic abuse. That's a person who is either having a bad day or they're actually just being completely innocuous, and it's us, we're responding to innocuous communication in a really bad way. Doesn't happen that often, I've got to be honest with you. Another great question to ask is what's the objective of the communication? If everything is above board and we're having completely horizontal rather than vertical communication between two sincere adults who have a mutually agreed upon objective, that sounds very pompous. The mutually agreed upon objective could be me and you meet up in a bar, have a couple of drinks, and watch the game on TV together. But if there's no agenda there and it's all horizontal, it's all open, what we're doing and why we're doing it, then that's non-abusive, that's not reaction-seeking communication. If something else is sneaked in, as Gary Klein would say, the totem pole of the cluster B is they're up here on the totem pole and you're down here, because they can't do horizontal. And them up here and you down there, that's equal in the world of the cluster B, in the world of the narcissist, the borderline and social personality and the histrionic. They're hyper entitled, they're basically spoiled brats in adult bodies. If that's not there, then no, it's not narcissistic abuse. If any of those elements are there at all, it ain't great. Now, I'm not trying to turn people into hypersensitive about any element of narcissism. A person could be a little bit arrogant, a person could be a bit manipulative or reaction seeking, but if you're seriously saying any one of these traits, you should be very, very careful with that person. It's not always a case of full-blown malignant NPD, but to be honest with you, it's really corrupting and corrosive for you to be in contact with anybody who even has strongly narcissistic traits. There isn't the carrying capacity for the effect of this kind of abuse is very low. So they don't have to be full-blown NPD, they could just have strong narcissistic traits. You should avoid them the same way you would avoid somebody with full-blown NPD. It's not worth it. It's not worth having people like that around you and in your life, because they have a very bad effect on you. So another tip that I would offer you is, if you're trying to figure out whether it's genuinely narcissistic abuse or if you're in an emotional flashback, well, wait until you've come out of the emotional flashback and see how you feel about the interaction. If Bob says to Sally, "Sally, can you please pass the salt?" and Sally flips out because that triggers an emotional flashback that has nothing to do with Bob, but it was all about some scenario that involved passing the salt, and Sally freaks out and wonders if Bob is being narcissistically abusive, that, if it's just an emotional flashback, will pass when the emotional flashback passes. If your emotional flashback has passed, a couple of days have gone by, you know that you've slept, you know that you've eaten, you know you've got no alcohol, no caffeine, no crap inside of you, and that you're basically healthy, sane and balanced, and you're still wondering what's going on, that's not good. That's an indicator that something is genuinely up. The other tip that I would give you is to look for a consistency over time. If there's a consistent series of scenarios that's played out over time that have led you to wonder whether this person might have something genuinely wrong with them, whether they might actually be sick with some kind of a cluster B personality disorder, that's a pretty bad indicator that there is actually something legitimately wrong there. Yes, people with CPTSD can be so full of emotional flashbacks that it's hard for them to see the reality of a situation. Yes, it can be the case that we do overreact to completely innocuous comments and statements that are given, but not over and over and over again over a long period of time. That's not likely. What is likely is that you feel so much guilt and shame, and you're so willing to take on responsibility for other people's crap, that in this scenario and asking this question, it's just one more example of you saying, no, it's not them, it must be me. Well, no. Normal communication between adults isn't bewildering, isn't humiliating, doesn't hurt, isn't a source of angst and sort of hand-wringing. I mean, the fact that you're here watching this video, that's an indicator to me that something is seriously up. Now, that doesn't mean that there might not be something wrong with you. Yes, okay, we hold that rationally as a possibility, as a constant. Could be CPTSD, could be something else, could be some other kind of personality disorder. Some people are obsessed with the idea that everybody's victimizing them. Yes, I know that, and I don't want to feed into people's psychosis via YouTube videos. That would not be helpful. But it is far more likely, on the whole, for most people, that what is happening is you kind of are wondering whether there's narcissistic abuse going on, and you kind of know there is, and you're checking out a few YouTube videos to kind of see, to do your homework and to make that decision. Somebody who's truly narcissistically abusive doesn't engage in the behaviour that you're engaging in, because they're absolutely certain. They don't have any questions, they have statements. They're not humble enough to go out and get help and to seek a second opinion and get advice. They just write people off because they know that they're always in the right. The last thing that I would say, that just reiterates my last point, the very fact that you're here asking this question is a strong indication. I can't think of many times where I've spoken to somebody who suspected that they were the victim of narcissistic abuse and it turned out they weren't. They were just completely hypersensitive, and they misunderstood what the other person had said over and over and over again for 15 years. It's just not likely, is it? It's just, okay, silly example, it could be just 3 or 4 months. You could be in the initial phases of a relationship. If the alarm bells are going off, please listen to them. And I'd much rather that people over-responded than under-responded. I'd much rather that people said, okay, being around, look, it could just be as simple as this, boys and girls. If Sally is around Bob, and Bob makes Sally feel like shit, and Bob makes Sally feel frightened and adrenalized and bewildered and confused, but he really isn't doing anything, that's just how Bob makes Sally feel. It doesn't matter whether he's narcissistically abusive or not. That guy is a wind-up for Sally. Similarly, if Bob has the same experience with Sally, there's no future in it. Just drop it. Just leave it. Unless, you've got a very, very good, strong reason to try and work through that, because working through that is very, very, very hard. It's very, very difficult. Maybe Bob looks, talks and acts exactly like Sally's extremely abusive father. Maybe Sally doesn't look, talk and act like Bob's extremely abusive mother or auntie or caregiver, whoever it was, but something in her demeanour, you know, maybe she's learned to be a bit kind of cocky and a bit sort of arrogant and jokingly dismissive of other people's feelings, but she's really not. She's actually genuinely a kind, compassionate person, but Bob doesn't know her well enough yet. Well, he's getting upset by her. She is putting him into an emotional flashback, even if she doesn't mean to. That means you really have to step back from that and go, okay, well, whether you are or not, whether you're cluster B or not, I can't really tell, but I know how I feel and I don't feel good. And because I care about how I feel, and I care about my sanity, my health and my serenity, I'm going to withdraw from the situation. Okay, boys and girls, I hope you found that useful, and I'd like to thank you for giving me your time and your attention, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.